The sound of the front door closing was not a slam. It was a quiet, deliberate click, the sound of a man gently shutting a book he had grown bored of reading. But in the hollow silence of our hallway, it echoed with the force of a detonation. I stood in the entryway, my hands still hovering in the empty space where I had just tried to stop him, my fingers grasping nothing but the stale air he left behind. The scent of his expensive cologne, a sharp, woody, aggressively confident fragrance he had started wearing only a month ago, lingered in the foyer like a ghost. I turned around slowly, my chest tight, and walked into the living room. I found Mia sitting on the absolute edge of the beige sofa. She was entirely motionless. Her blue pediatric nebulizer mask was still draped loosely around her thin neck, the clear plastic tubing coiling over her lap like a dormant snake. Her small, fragile hands were pressed flat against her thighs. She wasn't looking at me. She was staring straight through the sheer white curtains of the front window, watching the taillights of David's black SUV fade into the evening dusk, swallowed by the suburban gloom. Beside her, the sofa cushion still held the shallow indentation where her brother, Leo, had been sitting just 10 minutes earlier. David had packed with the ruthless, terrifying efficiency of a man who had been orchestrating his exit long before he ever announced it. 2 large leather suitcases for himself, 1 matching duffel bag for Leo, nothing for Mia, nothing for me. When I had come downstairs from folding laundry, completely oblivious to the fracture about to split my world in two, I had found him standing in the hallway with Leo's baseball cleats in one hand and his car keys in the other. He hadn't even looked at me when he spoke. "I need space, Claire," he had said, his voice stripped of any emotion, as if he were canceling a magazine subscription rather than ending a 10-year marriage. "And Leo needs a father who isn't drowning in medical bills and hospital visits. He needs a normal life." I remember the way the hardwood floor seemed to tilt beneath my feet. "You're taking him?" I had asked, my voice barely a whisper, terrified that the children, who were watching cartoons in the next room, would hear. "You're splitting them up?" "David, what are you talking about? Mia's equipment is too much to move," he had replied. His tone was as flat and pragmatic as if he were discussing shipping logistics. He gestured vaguely toward the living room, where the rhythmic, mechanical hum of Mia's oxygen concentrator provided a constant, low-grade soundtrack to our lives. "She needs her routine. She needs you. I'm taking Leo to the new apartment. We'll figure out a formal schedule later." I had stepped squarely between him and the heavy oak door. I told him he was out of his mind. I told him he could not just walk out on his family and unilaterally decide to take our healthy 8-year-old son while leaving our sick 6-year-old daughter behind. But David had simply sighed, a heavy, performative sigh that suggested I was the one being hysterical, the one being unreasonable, and stepped around me. He had called Leo's name, and Leo had come bounding down the stairs, wearing his favorite denim jacket, holding a brand-new, top-of-the-line tablet that David had bought him just the day before. Leo hadn't fully understood what was happening. David had told him they were going on a boys' weekend, a special trip just for the two of them. Leo had kissed my cheek, waved a distracted goodbye to his sister, and walked out the door, entirely absorbed by the glowing screen in his hands. Now, the house was suffocatingly silent. Only the faint hum of the refrigerator filled the void. I walked over to the sofa and knelt in front of Mia. Up close, I could hear her breathing. It was slightly labored, a familiar, wet rattle deep in her chest that warned me a flare-up was imminent. Mia had been diagnosed with chronic severe asthma and a complex autoimmune disorder when she was 3. Since then, our lives had been measured not in seasons or holidays, but in oxygen saturation levels, daily steroid regimens, nebulizer treatments, and the sterile, antiseptic smell of pediatric emergency rooms. "Is Leo coming back for dinner?" she asked. Her voice was raspy from the albuterol. She didn't look at me. Her dark eyes remained fixed on the window, watching the empty street. "No, sweetie," I said, forcing my voice to remain perfectly steady, swallowing the massive lump of panic rising in my throat. "Leo is going to stay with Daddy for a little while." Mia swallowed. Her small fingers reached down and began picking at the edge of her nebulizer tubing. It was a nervous habit she had developed over the years of endless hospital stays. We sat in silence for a long moment. Then, she asked the question that broke something fundamental open inside me. "Mommy, did Daddy leave because I'm a burden?" My stomach went ice cold. The blood rushed from my face. Burden. It was a heavy, ugly word. A word that was entirely too large, too sharp for a 6-year-old's mouth. "Who told you that?" I asked, my heart hammering violently against my ribs. I reached out and gently took her hands, stopping her from picking at the plastic tube. "Mia, look at me. Who said that word to you?" Mia finally turned her head and looked at me. Her face held no anger. There were no tears. There was only a quiet, devastating, absolute acceptance. And that frightened me far more than an emotional breakdown would have. "Daddy told his phone," she whispered, her eyes searching mine for confirmation. "He was in the kitchen yesterday. He thought I was asleep on the couch. He said he was only taking the healthy one because the sick one is a burden. He said I cost too much money and I make everyone sad." I caught my breath. My grip on her small hands tightened involuntarily, and I quickly loosened it when she flinched. The betrayal was so profound, so intensely cruel, that for a second, I felt physically nauseous. I realized in that exact moment that the end of our marriage had absolutely nothing to do with David needing space. It had nothing to do with us growing apart. It was entirely about David curating his life. He wanted the son who could play Little League baseball, the son who looked perfectly tanned and healthy in holiday family photographs, the son who required no specialized care, no sleepless nights, no copays. He had looked at his 2 children and calculated their value based on their convenience. He had kept the one who bolstered his ego and casually discarded the child who required effort, sacrifice, and unconditional love. "Listen to me," I said, my voice dropping an octave, fierce and resolute enough to make her blink in surprise. "You are not a burden. Do you hear me? You are Mia. You are my daughter. You are the bravest girl I have ever known, and you belong here. You are exactly where you are supposed to be, and I will never, ever leave you." She nodded slowly, but I could see the shadows lingering in her eyes. The damage had been done. A father is supposed to be a child's first line of defense against the cruelties of the world. When that father is the one inflicting the cruelty, the wound is a unique kind of incurable. 6 months passed. 6 months of learning how to breathe without the illusion of a partner. 6 months of single motherhood forged in the fires of medical crises and financial terror. The transition was brutal. I had to drop down to part-time hours at my accounting firm to manage Mia's medical appointments, which meant our income was slashed in half. David lived 15 miles away in a luxury, high-rise apartment in the downtown district. He paid the absolute minimum in state-mandated child support, claiming that his lucrative consulting business was going through a restructuring phase and that his income had drastically decreased. Meanwhile, his social media accounts painted a wildly different, glittering reality. Though I had blocked him on everything, mutual friends occasionally and sometimes maliciously passed along screenshots. There were pictures of David, Leo, and David's new girlfriend, Sarah, a 26-year-old marketing executive he had met at a conference in Chicago on weekend ski trips in Aspen. There were photos of Leo at private batting practice facilities. Pictures of the 3 of them smiling brightly over plates of lobster at upscale waterfront restaurants. They looked like an advertisement for a modern, affluent, blended family. There were never any pictures of Mia. It was as if she had been erased from his biography entirely. Leo visited us every other weekend, per the temporary custody arrangement we had drawn up in mediation, but he returned to my house, changed each time. The sweet, protective boy who used to build elaborate cardboard forts with his sister and read to her when she was too sick to sit up had vanished. In his place was a guarded, aloof child who seemed entirely out of place in our modest, medical supply-filled home. He would sit on the couch for hours, scrolling endlessly through the expensive smartphone his father had given him, wearing designer clothes that he adamantly refused to let get dirty. When Mia, desperate for her brother's attention, would ask him to play a board game or watch a movie, Leo would barely glance up from his screen. "I'm busy, Mia," he would mutter. "Maybe later." But later never came. I watched this invisible chasm widen between them, powerless to stop it. I began to notice how Leo's shoulders would stiffen, how his jaw would clench in irritation whenever Mia started to cough. The true extent of David's poison revealed itself on a rainy Saturday in late October. Mia was struggling with a mild asthma exacerbation. The damp weather always wreaked havoc on her lungs. I was in the living room, trying to keep her calm while setting up the nebulizer machine. I realized I had left her rescue inhaler on the kitchen counter after her morning dose. "Leo, honey," I called out to him. He was in the kitchen, pouring himself a glass of orange juice. "Can you please bring me Mia's red inhaler? It's right next to the microwave." Leo walked into the living room holding the small plastic device, but instead of handing it to Mia, he held it out to me. His expression was a bizarre, heartbreaking mix of annoyance and disdain. "Dad says she wouldn't cough so much if you didn't coddle her," Leo muttered, dropping the inhaler into my palm. I stopped dead. The small plastic inhaler felt as heavy as an anvil in my hand. The rhythmic wheezing of Mia's breathing seemed to pause. "What did you just say?" I asked, my voice dangerously quiet. Leo looked away, suddenly interested in the toe of his expensive sneakers. He rubbed the edge of his pristine brand-name sleeve. "Dad says she acts sick on purpose to get attention. He says you make her worse because you like playing the victim. He says normal families don't spend their whole weekend at the pharmacy." I stared at my 8-year-old son, feeling a profound, sickening wave of horror wash over me. I didn't yell at him. I couldn't. I knew with absolute certainty that these were not his words. They were David's words, planted meticulously like toxic seeds in a child's fertile mind. David was actively training Leo to view his own sister not as a sibling to be loved, but as a manipulative inconvenience. He was teaching our son that love and acceptance were strictly conditional, dependent entirely on being healthy, being quiet, being perfect. I knelt down so I was at eye level with Leo. "Your sister does not act sick, Leo. Her lungs do not work the same way yours do. She needs medicine to breathe, just like you need food to grow. It is not her fault, and it is not a trick for attention." Leo just shrugged. His eyes glazed over with that practiced, detached apathy he had learned from his father. "Dad says what Dad says," he mumbled, turning around and retreating upstairs to his room. I sat back on my heels, pulling Mia close to my chest, as the nebulizer machine hissed to life, pumping medicated mist into her small mask. I held her as she breathed, staring at the empty staircase. I told myself that time would eventually show Leo the truth. I told myself that a child's fundamental goodness would eventually win out over a bitter parent's manipulation. It was the explanation that asked the least of me. It allowed me to avoid a direct confrontation with a man who terrified me. And it was the biggest mistake I could have possibly made. The thick, heavy legal envelope arrived on a Tuesday afternoon, brought to the door by a stone-faced process server. It had been a particularly grueling week. Mia's immune system had crashed, resulting in a severe respiratory infection that had kept us both awake for 3 consecutive nights. I was running on caffeine, sheer willpower, and the adrenaline of maternal panic. I signed for the envelope with a shaking hand, placed it on the kitchen island, and waited until Mia was finally asleep before I tore it open. As I pulled out the stack of documents, the bold, black legal jargon blurred before my exhausted eyes. But as I forced myself to read the paragraphs, the demands became unmistakably, devastatingly clear. David was not just filing for divorce. He was filing an emergency petition for full, sole, legal and physical custody of both Leo and Mia. My heart stuttered. Why would he want Mia? He had abandoned her. He had called her a burden. But as I read further, the true, sinister nature of his plan revealed itself. He wasn't doing this because he suddenly wanted to be a father to his sick daughter. He was doing this to completely obliterate me. David was petitioning the court for exclusive possession of the marital home, the 4-bedroom house, that I had personally paid the mortgage on for the last 3 years while he funneled his income into his business. His lawyers argued that the children needed residential stability in their childhood home, a stability which David, with his superior financial standing, would kindly provide. But it was the addendum to the petition that made my blood run cold and the room spin wildly around me. David's legal team had drafted a narrative of pure, unadulterated fiction. The petition claimed that I was an unfit, emotionally unstable mother. It alleged that I suffered from severe, untreated anxiety, that I was actively isolating the children from their father, and most horrifyingly of all, it formally suggested that I was medically abusing Mia. The document heavily implied Munchausen syndrome by proxy. It stated that I exaggerated Mia's illnesses, subjected her to unnecessary medical treatments, and kept her weak and dependent on me, in a desperate bid for attention, and to extort higher child support and alimony from him. If he won this, the consequences were unthinkable. If he got full custody, he wouldn't have to pay a single cent in child support. If he got the house, he would force me out onto the street, leaving me to scramble for a cramped apartment while he moved Sarah into the home I had built. Worse, he would have total control over Mia's medical care. A man who couldn't even be bothered to hand her an inhaler would be in charge of her life-saving treatments. He was weaponizing the family court system to erase me. I called my lawyer, Evelyn, at 8 a.m. the next morning. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely hold the phone to my ear. I read the petition aloud to her, my voice cracking, tears of absolute rage and terror spilling down my face. Evelyn listened quietly until I was finished. She was a seasoned family law attorney, a woman with silver hair and a demeanor as tough as reinforced steel. She did not panic. "Take a deep breath, Claire," Evelyn said, her voice entirely devoid of the hysteria I was feeling. "Listen to me very carefully. He is building a narrative. He wants to walk into that courtroom and present himself as the successful, stable, heroic father saving his children from a hysterical, emotionally erratic mother." "But it's a lie!" I sobbed. "He left her, Evelyn." He walked out the door and called her a burden. He told Leo she was damaged goods. He hasn't been to a single doctor's appointment in 3 years. "I believe you," Evelyn said softly. "But the medical abuse claim is a classic litigation tactic. It's designed to terrify you, to put you on the defensive, and to force you to accept a terrible settlement just to make it go away. It's a smokescreen." "How do we prove it's a smokescreen?" I asked, wiping my eyes. "Do you have his words in writing?" Evelyn asked. "Did he ever text you that she was a burden? Did he email you saying he didn't want her?" "No," I admitted, my heart sinking. "He's too smart for that. He only ever said it out loud. Mia heard him say it to his phone. Leo repeats things David says to him." I heard Evelyn's sigh on the other end of the line. It was not a comforting sound. "Claire, I have to be brutally honest with you. A 6-year-old's hearsay and an 8-year-old's parroted insults will not hold up against a well-dressed, wealthy man in a bespoke suit crying crocodile tears for a judge. Judges see he said, she said, every single day. If we go in there with nothing but your word against his, and he has a team of expensive experts claiming you're overly anxious, we could lose." "We can't lose," I whispered, looking toward the stairs where Mia was sleeping. "If he takes her, Evelyn, if he takes her, she'll die. He won't give her the treatments. He thinks it's all fake." "Then we need proof of his character," Evelyn said, her voice hardening with determination. "We need absolute, undeniable proof of how David Sterling treats his sick daughter when he thinks no one in the world is watching. Think, Claire. Is there anything at all?" I hung up the phone an hour later, my mind racing through a decade of memories, searching for a single slip-up, a single piece of evidence that could expose the monster hiding behind the tailored suits and the perfect smile. And then, as I stood in the center of the living room, my eyes drifted up to the ceiling corner. Tucked discreetly next to the crown molding, blending perfectly into the white paint, was a small, dome-shaped piece of black plastic. The smart home security camera. 2 years before David left, we had experienced a string of aggressive break-ins in our affluent neighborhood. David, a man obsessed with controlling his environment and protecting his assets, had insisted on installing a high-end, top-tier security system. He had hired professionals to wire small cameras into the living room, the kitchen, and the main hallway. When he moved out 6 months ago, one of the first things he had done was cancel the $30 monthly cloud subscription for the camera storage, claiming to me in an email that it was an unnecessary expense now that he wasn't there to monitor it. The cameras had essentially gone dark, acting only as useless plastic ornaments. But David, for all his meticulous, cold-blooded planning, suffered from an immense ego. And that ego had caused him to forget one critical, devastating detail. David never trusted cloud servers with his personal data. When he had the system installed, he had insisted the technicians wire the cameras to simultaneously record to a local backup, a massive, encrypted hard drive locked inside a metal server rack in our dusty, unfinished basement. My heart began to pound a frantic rhythm against my ribs. If that hard drive was still active on the day he left, if it had captured what he said. I didn't even put on shoes. I practically flew down the basement stairs, my bare feet hitting the cold concrete floor. I navigated through boxes of old winter clothes and holiday decorations until I reached the back corner. The metal server rack was still there, quietly humming in the dark. I grabbed my laptop from upstairs, brought it down, and plugged the USB cable into the main drive. A password prompt instantly flashed on the screen. Encrypted volume. Please enter the master password. I stared at the blinking cursor. David changed his passwords obsessively. I tried his birthday. Incorrect. I tried our anniversary. Incorrect. I tried Leo's birthday. Incorrect. I sat on the freezing concrete floor, taking a deep, shuddering breath. I closed my eyes and thought about David. I thought about his narcissism. I thought about his predictability when it came to his own desires. I typed in Sarah's birth year, followed immediately by the name of his favorite college football team, and the year they won the national championship. 1998. Bulldogs 2. 1. I hit enter. The loading icon spun for 2 agonizing seconds, and then the drive opened. Folders upon folders of archived, time-stamped video and audio files populated my screen. I had just broken into the vault of David's true self. I began scrolling, hunting for the dates leading up to the week he abandoned us. What I found in those files over the next 3 hours would make me physically sick to my stomach. But it would also become the weapon that would destroy him. The glow of the laptop screen was the only light in the damp, freezing basement. I sat cross-legged on the concrete floor, my fingers trembling over the trackpad as I navigated through the labyrinth of archived files. The hard drive had meticulously categorized everything by date, time, and camera location. I started with the month leading up to David's departure. My heart pounded against my ribs, a sickening drumbeat of anticipation and dread. I clicked on a file dated October 14th, 4:12 p.m., labeled Living Room Cam 1. The video flickered to life in high definition. There was David, sitting on our beige sofa, wearing his expensive noise-canceling headphones, typing furiously on his laptop. A moment later, a tiny figure walked into the frame. It was Mia. She was wearing her oversized pink pajamas, her shoulders heaving as she struggled to pull in a full breath. She walked up to her father and tugged on his sleeve. In the video, David didn't even take off his headphones. He just swatted her hand away like a pesky insect and pointed toward the kitchen. Mia stood there for another full minute, her chest visibly working overtime, wheezing so loudly the camera's microphone picked it up. Finally, David slammed his laptop shut, glared at her, and mouthed something angry before storming upstairs. He left his 6-year-old daughter standing alone, gasping for air. She had to climb onto the kitchen counter herself to reach her emergency inhaler. A choked sob escaped my throat. I had been at the grocery store during that timestamp. He had told me they had a great afternoon together. I kept digging. I opened a file from November 2nd, 2 days before he moved out. It was from the kitchen, Cam. David was packing a cardboard box with his expensive whiskey collection. Leo, wearing his baseball uniform, was standing beside the island, drinking a juice box. "Dad, are we taking Mia's toys to the new place?" Leo asked in the video, his innocent voice echoing through the basement speakers. David didn't look up from his packing tape. "No, Leo. We're not taking Mia." "Why?" David stopped taping. He leaned against the counter and looked down at his 8-year-old son. "Because your sister is damaged goods, Leo. She ruins every vacation, every weekend, every normal thing we try to do. You and me, we're going to have fun at the new place. We don't have time to play hospital anymore. Let your mother deal with that burden." I pressed my hand over my mouth, the physical revulsion making me dizzy. Hearing it secondhand from my children had been devastating. Hearing it directly from his mouth, seeing the casual, calculated cruelty in his eyes as he poisoned our son's mind, was a completely different kind of agony. But I needed the nail in the coffin. I needed the proof of his legal malice. I clicked on the files from November 4th, the morning he left. I found it in hallway cam 2. Time, 8:45 a.m. Just 20 minutes before I came downstairs. David was pacing the foyer, his phone pressed to his ear. He was smiling, a smug, victorious smile. "Yeah, Sarah, I'm almost packed." David's voice came through the speakers, crystal clear. He let out a dark, mocking chuckle. "Just taking the boy. I'm leaving the sick one here. Let Claire drown in the medical bills. She loves playing the martyr anyway." He paused, listening to the woman on the other end. Then, he delivered the words that would ultimately seal his fate. "Don't worry about the house," David said, his tone turning venomous. "I've already talked to the lawyers. Once I get settled in the apartment and establish Leo's routine, we'll file for emergency full custody. We'll claim Claire is crazy, maybe say she's making the kid sick for attention. The courts eat that Munchausen stuff up. I'll get full custody, which means zero child support, and I'll force a sale of the house or take exclusive possession. She won't have the money to fight me. She'll be out on the street in 6 months." The video ended. The screen went black. I sat in the dark basement for a long time, the silence pressing in on me. I wasn't crying anymore. The tears had entirely evaporated, burned away by a cold, searing, indestructible fury. David had planned to destroy my life, strip me of my children, and leave me destitute, all because he was too selfish to love a child who wasn't perfectly healthy. I exported the files to 3 separate encrypted flash drives. I emailed a copy to Evelyn's secure server. And then, I took the original hard drive, placed it in a heavily padded box, and locked it in a safe deposit box at my bank the very next morning. When Evelyn watched the videos in her plush mahogany-paneled office the next day, she didn't say a word. She sat perfectly still, her hands steepled beneath her chin, her eyes locked on the screen. When the final video ended, the one of David outlining his plot to steal the house and frame me for medical abuse, Evelyn slowly closed her laptop. She looked up at me, and for the first time since I had met her, there was a predatory gleam in her eyes. "Claire," Evelyn said softly, "we are not going to mention these tapes in our preliminary filings. We are not going to warn his legal team. We are going to let Mr. Sterling walk into that courtroom, swear an oath on the Bible, and build his beautiful, elaborate house of cards." She leaned forward, her silver pen tapping rhythmically against her mahogany desk. "And then, we are going to burn it to the ground." The day of the custody hearing arrived with a biting, bitter winter chill. The courtroom was smaller and far more sterile than I had imagined. There were no grand galleries, just beige walls, harsh fluorescent lighting, and the heavy, suffocating tension of a room where lives were routinely dismantled. David sat beside his expensive attorney, a shark-like man named Mr. Vance, at the petitioner's table. David was wearing a bespoke, perfectly tailored navy suit. He looked wealthy, respectable, and entirely unbothered. When I walked in with Evelyn and took my seat, David caught my eye. He offered me a small, pitying, patronizing smile. It was the smile of a man who believed he had already won the war. He leaned over and whispered something behind his hand to his lawyer, who chuckled quietly. Judge Harrison entered the room. She was a stern, no-nonsense woman with graying hair pulled into a tight bun and a reputation for having absolutely zero tolerance for theatricality in her courtroom. She called the court to order and looked over her glasses at the 2 tables. Mr. Vance stood up first. For 45 excruciating minutes, he painted a masterpiece of pure fiction. He described David as a devoted, heartbroken father, a successful businessman who had been systematically alienated and pushed out of his own home by a deeply unstable, neurotic woman. He spoke of Leo as a hostage to my emotional erraticism. And then, Vance pivoted to Mia. "Your Honor," Vance said, his voice dripping with synthetic, practiced sympathy. "Mr. Sterling only wants to rescue his children from an environment of severe medical anxiety and emotional suffocation. We have submitted affidavits suggesting that the respondent, Miss Claire Sterling, suffers from severe psychological distress. She exaggerates her daughter's illnesses, subjecting the poor child to unnecessary treatments to keep her dependent, and to extort my client for financial gain." At the table, David took out a pristine white handkerchief and dabbed at his dry eyes. He was playing the perfect, aggrieved, protective dad. It was an Oscar-worthy performance. "Mr. Sterling seeks full, sole, legal, and physical custody of both children," Vance concluded, his voice ringing with self-righteousness. "And to minimize the disruption to the children's lives, He requests exclusive possession of the marital home. He is prepared to take on the full burden of their care today. Judge Harrison made a note in her ledger, her expression unreadable. She turned to our table. Miss Sterling's counsel. Your response? Evelyn stood up slowly. She buttoned her blazer, adjusted her glasses, and picked up a single manila folder. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't launch into a passionate, defensive monologue. She was the picture of terrifying calm. Your Honor, Evelyn began, her voice steady and clear. My client does not deny that her daughter, Mia, requires significant medical care. What she categorically denies is the petitioner's claim that he has ever been involved in, supportive of, or present for that care. Objection, Mr. Vance snapped, half standing. Baseless character assassination. Overruled, Judge Harrison said without looking up. Let her finish. In fact, Your Honor, Evelyn continued smoothly, pacing a few steps in front of our table, we contend that Mr. Sterling abandoned his daughter specifically because of her medical needs. We contend that his current petition for full custody is a fraudulent, malicious, and entirely financially motivated plot designed to evict my client from her home and eliminate his child support obligations. Mr. Vance scoffed loudly. David shook his head, looking up at the ceiling as if asking God for patience. Those are severe allegations, Counselor, Judge Harrison warned, her eyes narrowing. Do you have evidence to support this narrative? I have exhibits, Your Honor, Evelyn said. She reached into her pocket and pulled out a sleek, black USB flash drive, video and audio recordings from the petitioner's own smart home security system, installed by him, in the marital home. They present a starkly different reality than the theatrical performance we just witnessed today. At the petitioner's table, David's posture violently shifted. The smug, patronizing smile instantly vanished from his face, replaced by a chalky, sickly pallor. He leaned over to Mr. Vance, his hands visibly shaking, whispering frantically. I could see the exact, horrifying moment David remembered the local backup drive in the basement. Your Honor, we object! Mr. Vance shouted, suddenly looking incredibly panicked. We have not reviewed this evidence in discovery. This is an ambush. The evidence was submitted to the clerk under seal yesterday morning, Mr. Vance. Fully within the procedural deadline for emergency rebuttal evidence, Evelyn countered flawlessly. Judge Harrison looked at David, noting his sudden panic, and then nodded at Evelyn. The court will allow it. Play the exhibits. A court clerk wheeled over a large monitor. Evelyn plugged in the drive. The courtroom descended into a dead, suffocating silence. The first video played. The courtroom watched in high definition as David sat on the couch with his headphones on, entirely ignoring his 6-year-old daughter as she gasped for air beside him, eventually swatting her away. I saw Judge Harrison's jaw tighten. Mr. Vance looked like he had just swallowed a stone. The second video played. The kitchen camera. The audio was crisp and loud in the quiet room. Your sister is damaged goods, Leo. We don't have time to play hospital anymore. Let your mother deal with that burden. A collective gasp echoed from the court stenographer. David was staring at the mahogany table, his knuckles bone white as he gripped the edge. Then, Evelyn played the final clip. The hallway camera, the morning he left. David's own voice, dripping with malice, filled the courtroom, echoing off the wood paneling. I'm leaving the sick one here. Let Claire drown in the medical bills. We'll claim Claire is crazy, maybe say she's making the kids sick for attention. I'll get full custody, which means 0 child support. She'll be out on the street in 6 months. The video ended. Evelyn quietly closed the laptop. The screen went black. The silence in the courtroom was absolute. It was so quiet you could hear the hum of the HVAC system. Judge Harrison stared at David for a long, terrible moment. The air in the room felt dangerously thin. When the judge finally spoke, her voice was so cold, so laced with professional fury, that it sent shivers down my spine. Mr. Sterling, Judge Harrison said softly, leaning over her bench. In my 22 years presiding over family court, I have heard parents say regrettable, ugly things in the heat of a contentious divorce. I have seen bitterness and anger, but I have rarely, if ever, witnessed such profound, calculated, psychopathic malice directed at a disabled child by her own father. David opened his mouth to speak, his face flushed with panic, but the judge raised a single finger, silencing him instantly. "You sat in my courtroom," she continued, her voice rising in volume, "and under penalty of perjury, you accused the mother of your children of severe medical abuse. You attempted to use the authority of this court to financially ruin and evict a woman whose only crime was caring for the child you casually discarded because she was inconvenient to your bachelor lifestyle." Mr. Vance was already packing his briefcase. He wasn't even looking at his client. The verdict was swift, brutal, and utterly devastating for him. Judge Harrison dismissed David's petition with extreme prejudice. She granted me full, sole, legal, and physical custody of both Leo and Mia immediately. Because of the clear evidence of emotional abuse and his recorded admission of plotting to weaponize the legal system, David was stripped of all standard visitation rights. He was granted supervised visitation only, at a state-approved facility, entirely at the children's discretion. Furthermore, citing his recorded intent to defraud me, the judge awarded me exclusive, permanent possession of the marital home. She ordered David to pay the entirety of my legal fees and instituted the absolute maximum allowable child support and medical alimony, ordered to be garnished directly from his corporate business accounts before he ever saw a dime. As the gavel slammed down like a thunderclap, David didn't look at me. His pristine, bespoke suit suddenly looked like a cheap costume that didn't fit him anymore. He was a broken, ruined man. It took time to undo the psychological damage David had left behind. Leo came home that evening. He walked through the front door with his expensive tablet and his designer jacket, looking around the house cautiously, as if he were a visitor waiting for the rules he had been living under to apply here. Mia was sitting at the kitchen table, drawing with crayons. She looked up when Leo walked in. She didn't rush to him. She just watched him, her small hands resting on the paper, waiting to see which version of her brother had returned. I knelt beside Leo in the hallway. I gently took the tablet from his hands and set it on the table. "You don't have to be perfect here, Leo," I told him, smoothing his hair. "You don't have to be quiet. You can be messy. You can be loud. You can be sad. You are safe here, and you will never, ever be sent away." He didn't cry right away. He just nodded, his lower lip trembling. But later that night, after the lights were out, I found him standing in the doorway of Mia's room. She was wearing her nebulizer mask, the machine humming steadily in the quiet house. Leo walked over to her bed. He didn't say a word. He just sat on the edge of the mattress, reached out, and held his little sister's hand until the machine turned off. A year later, David is nothing but a ghost in our lives. He rarely uses his supervised visitation hours. He can't stand the humiliation of being watched by a social worker. The child support is pulled from his accounts automatically, funding Mia's treatments without issue. The smart home cameras in our house are gone, replaced by framed artwork that Mia and Leo painted together. Yesterday, Leo had a championship baseball game. Mia wanted to go to cheer him on. Before we left the house, I was gathering the snacks, and I saw Leo carrying Mia's heavy medical bag, slinging it effortlessly over his shoulder right next to his bat bag. "I got it, Mom," he said when I reached for it. He smiled, a genuine, bright smile that reached his eyes. Mia walked out to the car, holding her big brother's hand. She wasn't a burden. She never had been. And the boy walking beside her was finally learning that a real family doesn't leave anyone behind.